All right, so we were the SMS used for data collection. But one of the big things we actually looked at was adoption by the community healthcare workers, and we looked at error rates before and after. The data that was being recorded originally had a tremendous amount of error rates, but through some clever parsing algorithms we wrote, we actually could identify if someone entered a height instead of a weight, and it would send an SMS message back being, are you sure this child's 145 feet tall? And so we were actually able to really improve the accuracy of the data being collected.
Kim Balassiano with the EPA. I had My Environment. We launched in April, so it seems like yesterday. So in terms of metrics, we were going to start applying a few metrics in the next couple of months, but we have had an email line open, and we've been getting really neat feedback. What's happening is people are responding and saying, hey, now that I've learned this, I'd really be interested in this and that and the other thing. So it's kind of a beta tool. We're trying to be responsive, and we have rolling development, and as people ask for things, we do try to address them and deploy new features and content. We are going to be using a few specific metric tools to see where they're clicking on the page. With a map application, you kind of know they're going to be clicking on the map and panning around, but then there's also the various accordions that hold the air-related content and the health-related content. We can see specifically which content are the most popular and also which are not interesting at all, have not been clicked on, and we'll probably remove that stuff, because if it's not useful to a large variety of people, then we probably will pull it off and try to be responsive.
Hi, I'm Rhyne. I did the invisible city concept, and because it's a concept and most of the code, the only person using the code right now is me, there's not a lot of metrics that I can do as far as tracking user metrics. But one of the things I found is that this depends on a high fidelity of knowledge about the public infrastructure, knowing what buildings are where. So when I say, okay, I'm at this particular lat long and I'm looking in this direction, what can I see? You need to have that resolution. And so that's why I initially focused it on a city municipality instead of saying, this is going to be a rural state government or something like that. So.
Sure. So DataSF being launched just a few weeks ago, we're still waiting to see what the pickup is. It's been very exciting so far, specifically in the space where you can request new data sets. We had an idea of what people might find interesting, but as always, it's very surprising. And so that's been a great development. And then on the civic DB side, again, I think as emblematic of these types of things, there are a small number of incredibly invested and dedicated folks who have been sticking with us and slowly picking up steam as we go.
I'm Steve Schultze. I did the recap project about the federal courts. On the metrics side of things, we've been very excited with the uptake and use of the tool. I think we're approaching something on the order of about 10,000 people who have downloaded the plugin, which for a relatively niche tool is pretty exciting. We're also excited about the fact that quite a few of our users and various other members of the general public are actually getting a hold of the courts and telling them, hey, we think that these policies should change. But I think our ultimate measure of success would be for our system to completely obsolete itself by motivating policy change at the courts, which would hopefully unleash the kind of sort of innovative generation of new tools that would only be possible with a fully open data set.
Okay, thanks. The next question actually comes from Twitter, and I'm going to modify it a little bit. The question was initially just for EPA and the courts about, are you seeing a shift in public opinion? But let me broaden it. Are you seeing, or again, I guess you just launched with DataSF, but is there a connection between what you're doing and a broader mission of your organization, and how does that connection play through? Has it provide feedback to you about what you're doing? How do your results provide feedback to how your agency or your organization is doing what it's doing? Let's go reverse order. We'll go back to you to start with.
So in our case, we're not an organization per se. The project comes out of the Center for IT Policy at Princeton. But we certainly represent a large constituency of folks that are interested in open public access to information. And I think that there have been folks who have for a long time felt like there's something wrong with the current model, that the transaction costs are getting in the way of free and open access to the law. And I think that by having something they can do it gives them something, a very concrete rallying point. And so while it's not motivating change within our organization per se, I think it's motivating more of a movement of folks from various walks coming together.
And as in, I think, any kind of large government, there are lots of moving pieces and lots of things to address. Again, with Data SF and having the space for users and data consumers to speak specifically about the data sets that are available, as well as to talk about what might be or what they wish could be, it's nice because it creates a little bit of a forcing function from one end of the spectrum. And then we've also been really lucky to have a lot of support from the higher levels of government, so the mayor in particular. And so I think with kind of support and demand on both ends, it's really pushing us to figure out how we can make this happen. And so coming from both sides.
Well, let me explore that a little. Do you see the potential for the project you're doing to then influence how the rest of San Francisco government does its job?
Absolutely.
Do you have an example or how?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, the crime map that was put up there is a great thing because the San Francisco Police Department does have a map application, and you know, that's still is going on, and it really was just a question of taking that information and passing it on to someone else to do what they like with it. And at the end of the day, it's to some degree or another, it's all about kind of better service and you know, what can we provide for the citizens of San Francisco and beyond. So I think that there's kind of an informing back and forth. The other important thing as well, and something that we haven't done yet but are really anxious to put up, is a way for someone to submit back. So to say, hey, this data set is wrong, and here's what's wrong with it. And particularly when it comes to 311 and looking at open 311 APIs and how can we continue that feedback loop. So I think that's probably the best example of the way that it can change other areas of government as well.
Okay. Rob, again, you're kind of it's not quite the same agency concept, but
I mean, I could speak to the potential
Yeah.
that I see. I mean, as far as influencing change, really this is, instead of the government being this, you know, sacred trust holder of all of this information, by opening its doors, I think they're more inclined to say, okay, well, what's the government collecting on me? Or everybody's wondering, you know, worried about all the information the government's collecting. Well, if that's exposed and it's accessible because it's been put in a package that people understand and they can use, it really kind of simplifies that question, where you can say, well, I don't know what the government knows about me. Well, now I know. Maybe I feel a little bit more comfortable about that. So I think there's that potential of impact.
You, Kim?
Well, my environment, the idea was hatched actually as we were watching the final tallies on who was going to become our next president. And of course, we were reading the tech papers that were circulating both from the McCain camp and the Obama camp. Both of them said transparency, transparency, transparency. So my environment was built to push what can be fairly complex and scientific data up, reduce the number of clicks that people need to get through to get information from the EPA. We are trying to completely change the way our web presence right now, because we're trying to meet that need for more clarity and more transparency. So I think we're part of a larger change. Whether we're going to push the hand further, I don't know. I'm not sure how that's going to work. I like to think we're part of sort of this broad effort across EPA to improve the way we deliver information. There are a lot of, the challenge with the EPA is that we, you know, to say some facility is dirtier than another, or to say that one city or municipality has, you know, less healthy people. It's a criticism, it's a judgment. It has impacts on tourism, on who moves there, economic development. The impacts are very large, so we have to tread lightly. Having said that, with my environment, we put a lot of pieces together that can draw pictures for people to get a sense of more holistically what this particular neighborhood is going through. And I think from a grassroots perspective, I'm hoping that that'll help with social and community organization. So are we forcing change in the government? I'm hoping that we're going to help change from a grassroots perspective.
And for us, I think there's three major areas of change. The first is at the community healthcare worker. We're basically crowdsourcing healthcare. And it goes other projects for crowdsourcing logistics, and we're doing it in an environment where there's only 4% penetration of computers. So it's massive change at the local level. Institutionally, there's a large change keeping UNICEF nimble, making us react real time in a situation where we never had access to rich data before. We never had access to real-time data. So that's really changing the way internal practices work. And the third change, I think, is larger, and that's that we started with one small pilot, and now we have 23 projects and across like 18 nations right now. And other agencies are also asking to join in and take some of the code, build off of what we're doing. So we're seeing a pretty large wave of support for the whole concept of this sort of data collection inside the UN family.
So there's been no resistance to doing it this way?
No, in fact, we're really disruptive because people don't see the consequences of what they're asking for. They see pretty maps and they see graphs and they're like, oh, we want that. And then what happens is then they have it and then they have to do something about it. And they haven't yet made that connection. So it'll be interesting this year to see, now that they have real-time data and people can point at it and say, why didn't you react to this? You knew exactly where the problems were and exactly what was happening. Maybe we'll have resistance next year. I don't know.
So here's a tweeted question for you. With 500 million Africans with cell phones, do they need they need a normal browser-driven website, do you think?
No, I think it's they leapfrogged. It's all moving. It's moving. They don't even have smartphones. It's all just SMS, the $10 phones, and it's amazing what everyone's doing with them. A lot of Web 2.0 services have been replicated with SMS in Africa, and to me, that's where the innovation is really happening in the world.
Okay. Well, since you've faced no resistance to what you're up to, let me ask the other four panelists whether you've faced resistance with what you're trying to do, and how, in particular, how have you overcome that resistance? And I don't want to. I mean, given the time constraints, I'm assuming you're having meetings and you're giving presentations, but is there anything, like one spark you found that really got the point across? Some catchphrase or something you did that beyond just sitting down and talking, or is that pretty much the way it's going in your organizations? Kim, why don't you go first?
When we started doing more Web 2.0 and blogs and wikis inside EPA a few years ago, people were really hesitant. The executives especially were concerned with this idea of crowdsourcing information. And what I kept telling people was, and I tell everyone I'm telling you now, what I say to people who are resistant is that you're crowdsourcing the information source, but you're still making the decision, right? So the decision still needs to be made by the executives and by the folks in charge. What's changing is that now you have to consume a whole lot more information when you come to that decision. But you're not crowdsourcing the decision. The decision stays in your hands. So don't be afraid of it. I mean, apart from that, my environment is hard in the way we present information. We regulate facilities, and we don't want to make paint industry as bad per se, but in effect, when you make a map and you show this facility has a violation, that facility is not going to be too happy about, millions of people hitting that site and seeing it like that. So on the other hand, if there are health implications, we want that message to get out. So we see a little resistance on that front. But in terms of crowdsourcing and resistance to using some of these new technologies, I feel like that's always a discussion point that I can get past with folks.
Again, I'm going to have to get back to you on resistance. As we're in progress, is kind of seeing the reactions that I get to people. This is really kind of the first public disclosure of this idea at all, so I guess to be determined there. One big technical challenge that I've run into is that it requires a feed directly from the camera in the iPhone. And the iPhone right now is the only platform I'm talking about because it's the only one really capable. There hasn't been an Android platform that's been capable enough yet, and Palm is even more locked down than the Apple is. So the technical challenge was actually getting access to that camera feed, and it was blocked, and it's still blocked in the public APIs. You actually have to have developer access to the developer APIs to get that to work. So that's probably the biggest landmine I've stepped into, and it's actually hindered my ability to actually show people demo concepts of it because you're under NDA. You can't show developer APIs to people who aren't under the NDA. The only practical concern that I've seen so far is some people look at this concept and they see where we're going with it and they go, whoa, there are a lot of social implications to this. You're really allowing the government in a certain way to exert more control. At the same time, they're giving you more control over the things that you didn't typically have control over. So I think it's just kind of the mind space, getting people to understand, this can actually work. It's not fiction, which is also something I've challenged. People are like, well, that's fictional, that's nice. It's a concept car. But the other idea is just saying, well, no, socially this is acceptable, and people kind of getting them to understand that.
And I certainly think that that change is scary, and something like this is such a remarkable change. So that different people react differently, and there have been lots of healthy discussions, not only about should we do this, should we not do this, but what's the most meaningful and what's the most effective way to do this broader, idea. And so definitely I've had a lot of conversations, but at the end of the day, I think that just sort of speaks for itself. Particularly, putting Data SF up and seeing the sort of uptake in it and seeing what's going on and work like Stamen did with the crime map. That's in many ways the kind of the best evidence that you can give and the best convincing point that you can give someone.
So our project is all about resistance. Our project exists only because there is very active resistance right now. That's not to say that the courts aren't listening and that they aren't reasonable. In fact, some of the ways that we've worked to make this case include my sitting down with a very receptive attorney for the Public Access Division and spending 3 hours talking about why we think the system should be different. So that's one way that we've worked to make the case. We've worked to make the case through RECAP as a sort of case study coming from the private sector, the private nonprofit academic sector, to show that such a thing is possible. And I hope that that is persuasive. And along the way, we're also doing things like, for example, I just released a draft working paper assessing the way that the judiciary does its budgeting process and talking about why PACER may not, in fact, cost as much as it seems like it should cost, and why user fees could potentially go down. And then we're also making the case and pushing against the resistance. Well, I say we, but I'm really speaking for the other folks working in this space, folks like Carl Malamud, who I mentioned, or Erica Wayne, who is a renegade law librarian at Stanford Law Library, who's put together a PACER petition with almost 1,000, go Google PACER petition, almost 1,000 signatures of people making their particular case for how PACER should be improved and why. And so I don't know which one of those will be the most persuasive, but hopefully the combination.
Okay, thanks. Micha, if you're out there, I see you're tweeting asking about whether any of these projects we're going to cover today are going to talk about connecting directly to the community. The answer is yes, especially the last session on government as partner, so I'm seeing some Twitter chatter about that. This session's about government providing information, so it's not quite as much about the partnering. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions from the floor. People have microphones or wandering around ready to, I see one back in the back corner back there.
Yeah, one of the things we've been sort of worried about and maybe hampered by my agency in terms of trying to present lots of information to the public is the whole issue of Section 508 compliance. And, certainly, good motivation there, but it's very difficult to try to deal with it. I'm wondering if people would comment on how they have dealt with it.
Go for it.
This isn't necessarily related to what I talked about, but I'm actually a user interface designer on my day job, I guess. And we do a lot of Section 508 compliance work. And the best way to answer your question is to say, instead of thinking of it as a checklist, thinking of it as design requirements. Mm-hmm. So when you're conceptualizing your solution, however you're going to provide the data feed, I would say consider those issues up front, and then you don't have to worry about them later. If you treat it as a checklist in the end game when you're getting ready to release this, it's going to seem tacked on, it's going to seem bolted on. And really the important thing is to think about these people as users. And when you're thinking about Section 508 compliance, you're designing directly to them. And so as we think of people who are non-disabled users and we think, well, we want to customize our experience for them, think of these disabled users in the same manner. And in a way, it's actually easier to design something for disabled people because you understand their experience because it's, in a sense, focused, as opposed to non-disabled users where they could be using all types of means to access it.
I can also speak to that. I was on a task force for Section 5081 compliance in 2001 at Accenture, and what we did is we really focused on educating all the developers and making sure they really understood how to code things from the get-go, like from the scratch, with these things in mind, as he was saying, and just it really makes sure that the agencies or the firms you're working with actually really understand semantic XHTML and web development techniques that will provide the accessibility needs.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you at EPA, accessibility is just a fact of life. It's the way you do things. But it's important also to be creative. So to recognize that what the law says is not that every single thing you put out has to be equally accessible to everyone. What it says is the information has to be accessible. So you have to find ways to do it. And it's just one example I'll give you is on our YouTube channel, before YouTube had captioning that was easy to use, we were simply linking back to our website with a version that had captions. So it takes some creativity, but as you said, it's just the way you do things. It's not something you bolt on at the end. Do you have another question from the audience? Okay, well, let me ask you my next question, which is, what kinds of, it was a good question that came up in the first panel. What kinds of surprises have you had? Has anything popped out? When I talk to, I give talks on social media to senior managers around EPA, and I always try to tell them, look, expect the unexpected. Something funky is going to happen. Someone's going to grab your thing and use it in a way you don't expect. Someone's to come back to you with a conclusion you had no idea anyone would draw that. Any of that starting to happen, and is it good, bad, indifferent? How are you reacting to it? That sort of thing. Let's start with you.
Yeah, so on the bad side, we've been working in countries where governments have been overthrown while we're there, leading to the projects being canceled.
That's probably a unique, maybe the State Department has that problem. But.
On the good side, though, that little bit about sending the thank you message back actually was sort of not a planned piece of what was going on, but we actually had hackers, developers in the field writing the code, and they sort of saw this opportunity and they suggested it, and we were like, well, hey, why not? And then that ended up being the most successful part of the project. So there's really something to having an agile software development process and having developers directly interacting with the people they're developing for.
I guess I had two surprises. One was that my 6-year-old, he was 5 at the time, my 5-year-old just started making his way through the website, which I thought was really cool. Like we designed it with the new EPA, had just put a new template out for its web face, and we deployed it with that new web face. And the whole point of it is more of this new way of like letting people hunt and peck for stuff and click, and it's not, there's no left hand bar navigation. And so my 5-year-old just started clicking around, drilling down, coming back out to where he started and being able to get back. So it's pretty cool. The other thing that was kind of a surprise, and it really gave me pause, was I got a letter from someone using the tool out in the public who said, wow, I was planning to move to such and such town in Tennessee, but when I looked up that site in my environment, and I saw some of the cancer risk estimates from air toxics, and I saw the radon issues, and I saw some of the water quality issues. I'm really debating whether I should bring my family to this, this place. And that made me worry a little, because that's a serious impact of knowing the details of a certain geography from a health perspective. So I thought it was really helpful to me to know that these are the kind of conclusions people are coming to.
That seems like pretty direct evidence of mission accomplishment to me for the whole tool. That someone actually told you that was what they were doing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Biggest surprise for me has been just the reaction when O'Reilly put out the abstract, and they actually didn't tell us they were posting the entire abstract online. I started getting kind of sideways hits. The beauty of social media. People that follow you on Twitter, they find you on Twitter, and all of a sudden they're posting replies to you, and you don't even know who they are. And one of those people happened to be a pretty well-known science fiction author that I had read as a child, and all of a sudden I find his blog, and he's writing about this, and give a really interesting kind of science fiction spin on it that I hadn't thought of, and he was really kind of taking it to saying, okay, let's jump ahead when a concept like Invisible City is the norm, and how does that affect society? How does that affect things like gangs? And he added a scenario to my abstract, basically saying, here's this, alternate scenario, and that was just a surprise because, I think sometimes in the government environment, we lace our shoes up in the morning. We get up, we put our tie on, we go to work, and we think about this, and we don't think about really the broader social impacts of this. But when you talk about something like government, it affects people at a social level that you just don't realize. And so that was kind of a surprising revelation.
I would say that there are two. One is the just enormous positive reaction that we got. We were hoping for that, but it was a very pleasant surprise. The second has been the types of data that people are looking for. I thought I had a pretty good idea. Crime would be up there, 311, but things like tow-away zones and street cleaning schedules, which when you think about it, makes a lot of sense, but not the first thing that you think of. So that has been very surprising.
I think our biggest surprise was the spectrum of folks that came out of the woodwork after we launched saying, we have an existing database of these documents and we'd like to share them with you. We got emails from commercial vendors that had been maintaining their own PACER databases. We got emails from academics. We got emails from people who focused on particular areas of the law. And we're actually only in early stages of integrating those with our system. So the nice surprise was as soon as we provided some sort of common platform for publicly and freely publishing these documents, a lot of people saw the case for that coming from a diversity of perspectives. And even commercial vendors, which are traditionally fairly proprietary around the data sets that they have, could see the benefit in having a shared public repository. So I think that was the most surprising thing.
So that's interesting. So I think a couple of you said, so just by telling the world you're interested in sharing this type of data, other people are going to come in and help you improve the product. I mean, that strikes me as something that very, very reflective of what Tim said this morning about some of the best killer apps are the ones that get better the more people use them. And I think that seems to mesh with that very well. We have maybe time for one more question.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
Well, he's got the
so
mic, sorry.
My name is Noel. I work for the New York State Senate and have a very unique opportunity where my department, the Office of the CIO, was politically engaged to do open data for the state Senate, right? And so at the San Francisco level, I really admire what you're doing. It's really, really amazing. But the mayor of San Francisco also is running for governor. And in my case, and I see some similarities within the San Francisco environment, is that these are politically driven fights. The mayor of New York is also doing the same thing. What is it like to work within that particular environment to ensure security and longevity of these particular programs, knowing the fact that they could be considered a political whim?
Sure. Well, I think that in any case, as this is becoming more and more fashionable, something more and more people talk about, there's always that concern and that risk. And my approach has really been to bake in the utility into the product, to where it's not a flash in the pan and it's not just a website, but can we make this so meaningful and so useful that it'll take on a life of its own, and in hopes of safeguarding against something like that.
All right, well, that gets us to the end of our time, so we're going to put up the slide now about voting. The panelists will stay up here for another minute. So please send your text to that number, and anyway, follow the instructions on your screen. It's actually easier for you to see than for me. And you've got about a minute or so to vote, and then we'll go off to lunch. Thank you very much to our panelists.